Dr. Halima. This is our first lecture on this consecutive translation course. Okay, now lecture number 1. Now the topic of this lecture is what is interpreting. This is the topic. This is the title of the lecture. Now, okay, look. For every lecture, I have mentioned some learning outcomes so that you ask yourself by the end of the lecture, am I able to achieve what I am supposed to achieve? Have I learned what I am supposed to learn? So by the end of this lecture, you should be able to identify the conceptual roots of interpreting. What I mean by the conceptual roots, it means the origin of interpreting, the origins of the word interpreting, and the origin of the concept. You know, concept means the idea, means the what you think of interpreting. Then you should be able to define interpreting. So first, you should be able to identify the origin of the concept of interpreting. Then you should be able to define interpreting. And then you should be able to practice interpreting at sentence level. So these are the learning outcomes. So inshallah, you should be able to, by the end of this lecture, you should be able to tell your friend, look, I know the origin of interpreting. I mean, I know something about the concept of interpreting. I can define interpreting, okay? And I can translate, I can interpret 1 or 2 sentences immediately, okay? These are the learning outcomes. Okay, now what we are going to cover in this lecture, really two main points: the conceptual roots of interpreting and defining interpreting. 2 points, and then we'll do some practice, okay? If we look at interpreting, we can see that it is like people regard it as like a translational activity. It is like a translation activity. It is like a translation, but it is a special type of translation. Interpreting is like translation, but it is not translation. It is a special type of translation, a special form of translation. This is number 1. You should understand it. If they say, oh, interpreting is like translation, no. It is, okay, I can say it is like translation, but it is not a translation. It is a special form of translation. Why? Because in ancient times, interpreting was like a practice among people. It was like a human being activity or practice, and interpreting came before translation, predates. It means the date of interpreting is before the date of translation. You know, so interpreting happened before the date of invention of writing or written translation. This is very important. So number 1, it is like a translation activity, but it is a special form of translation. Interpreting is older than translation. It happened, or it took place, or it started before the invention of writing or written translation. But when when can we trace? I mean, how can we trace interpreting back in the history? When did interpreting start in history? Here, they say Akkadiyin, ancient Semitic language of Assyria and Babylonia around 1900 BC. Now, whether this is true or not, it's not really that important, to be honest. What is important is that, okay, interpreting started long time ago and probably 1900 before Christ, I mean BC. It means about 4000. Interpreting started in Syria and in probably Babylonia, Assyric language, Assyria language, a language that was used in that area of Syria, and Babylonia is in between Syria and Iraq. So that in that place and during that time, interpreting started to take place. So the Akkadian root, means the Akkadian origin of interpreting, you can see Targumanu. I mean, you can say Turjuman. Turjuman is an Arabic word, but it seems that originally it came from this word Targumana. So via an etymological sideline, etymological means etymology, the study of the origin of the word. The origin of Turjuman probably came from Turgumana. Etymology means the study of the origin of words or the roots of the words. Sideline from Arabic, as you can see. Then this meaning or this word helped the English to create a new word, a new term for interpreter, dragoman. Dragoman. This is an English word. In Arabic, targumanu, and in English, dragoman. Dragoman means, I mean, the origin of interpreter was dragoman in English, and in Arabic or in Akkadian, the Akkadian root targumanu, you know, came from Arabic, to be honest, you know, via an etymological sideline from Arabic. And this this word gave rise to the autonomous English term for interpreter, dragoman. So these are, you know, the roots of interpreting, the origin of the word interpreting or the concept of interpreting. Let's see, there is something more. That was, I mean, the this one is really very, very old. I mean, this is the old origin of the word interpreting or the concept of interpreting is referred to the Akkadian. I mean, it appeared in 19,000 BC. But now in modern times, not in modern times means 100 or 200 years, but after Christ, after BC, the English word interpreter was derived from the Latin interpres, in the sense of expounder. So the origin of the word interpreter in Latin, interpres. So English took the word from Latin and used it. In Latin, there is a word called interpres. And interpres in Latin means expounder. To expound means to explain. It's more or less the same. Interpret and explain, but probably in a different language. So interpres is to explain what is obscure. It means what is not clear, what is hidden, so to make it clear. Okay? So the semantic root of this, expounder is not clear, according to research. Okay, this is one point about the origin of the word interpreter in English. The origin of the word interpreter in English goes back to the Latin word interpres. What is the meaning of interpres? It means to expound, or the expounder. It means a person who explains things which are not clear or which are obscure. Okay? Now there is another point. The Latin term interpres interpres means explaining the meaning. So another meaning of interpres means to explain the meaning. Making sense of what others have difficulty understanding is highly appropriate semantic foundation for interpreter and interpreting in our current understanding. In spite of what we have said so far, we can say that the Latin term interpres indicates to someone who is explaining the meaning. Explaining the meaning means making sense of what others have difficulty understanding. It is exactly like the job of the interpreter in our current meaning. So the meaning of an interpreter is someone who makes something obscure clear, and who tries to explain things which are not clear to someone who find it difficult to understand. In other words, an interpreter is someone who is trying to explain the meaning of something in English into Arabic, or because Arabic speakers find it difficult to understand the English language. So the interpreter here takes this piece of or a text or an utterance and say, okay, I'm going to explain this to you in Arabic, or I'm explaining to English people the meaning of what this Arab person has said. So now I hope that you have some idea about the origin of the concept of interpreting. Okay, so having said that, we can now establish, or we can define interpreting. Now you know the conceptual roots of interpreting, how it started, and the origin of interpreting in the old times, and the origin of interpreting in Latin, and the origin of and the meaning of interpreting or interpreter in English in current times. Okay, so now we can say, okay, what do we mean? How can we define interpreting? What distinguishes interpreting from other types of translation activity is its immediacy. Learn it. Immediacy. This what makes interpreting different from any other types of translation. It's immediacy. Immediacy, it means like you do the interpreting immediately. ادخل, come in. اخرج, get out. So immediately I interpret the word. تعال إلى هنا, come here. ادرس جيدا, work hard. This is what we mean by immediacy. Immediacy, to translate, to interpret immediately after you have heard an utterance. Okay? Immediacy. This is what makes interpreting different from translation. All right? So in principle, interpreting is performed here and now. Not there and later, here and now. Why? Because people would like to get engaged in the communication process, you know, when there is a barrier in language and culture. In other words, if you want to get engaged in what a group of English people doing, and you are here, and they are here, and they are talking in English, and you want to really know what they are doing. So you get an interpreter, and you say, all right, could you please tell us what they are doing? Here, the job of the interpreter is to translate, is to interpret verbally, orally. Here and now. Here and now. Immediately, he is or she is translating what they are doing or what's happening. Okay? So this is what we mean by interpreting, defining interpreting. I mean, what makes it different from other types of translation. Okay? So you need to really bear in mind that the main characteristics of interpreting is its immediacy, and it takes place here and now. Of course, you need to transfer, you know, and to transfer what's happening in the other language. I mean, you need to really cross over the barriers of language and culture, not only language. We will talk about this in due course. But now let's focus on the meaning and the concept of interpreting and the definition of interpreting. Because in any type of studies, you know, you need to establish some kind of definition, some kind of conception. You need to establish concepts. So now you know something about the conceptual roots of interpreting. Now you know what we really mean by interpreting, or the definition of interpreting. Here there is some more. Like, okay, I'll give you an example now. Now, what we said here, we said, okay, what makes interpreting different from other types of translation is its immediacy and here and now. I will give you an example. I can read it out, and then you say to me, okay, Dr. Halima, can you interpret this into Arabic? And I can look at it. So there are two types, consecutive translation and simultaneous translation, consecutive interpreting and simultaneous interpreting. We'll talk about it, inshallah, in due course. But an example like this, here, this example, this sentence, I got it from the Independent newspaper. It's about transport, and listen. Dozens more British Airways flights to and from Heathrow were cancelled yesterday as the airline sought to avoid the mayhem that passengers experienced at the weekend. عشرات من الرحلات خطوط الطيران البريطانية من وإلى مطار هيثرو تم إلغائها البارحة، وذلك محاولة من الخطوط الجوية البريطانية تجنب أي صخب عانى منه المسافرون في عطلة الأسبوع. You know, this is interpreting. Now somebody might say, well, I could do better, I could do worse. Then it's different. But what I've tried to do is to interpret what I've seen here immediately, and trying to convey the message. I hope that you have understood. You listen to my interpreting and see, but don't be really rigid about your interpreting. We will talk about it. What matters in interpreting is the message. The message. You know, don't go, you know, but of course, if you can do it better, why not? If you are really good at Arabic, then you could come up with a better translation than mine, you know. So interpreting really requires a lot of experience and expertise in both English and Arabic. Another sentence. The initial scheduled departure of the day to Stockholm was the first casualty, and cancellations of some short-haul services continued until noon. أول رحلة لهذا اليوم إلى ستوكهولم كانت أول ضحية، واستمروا في إلغاء الخدمات البسيطة حتى الظهر. ترجمة فورية. If I think about it again, then I could do better, but it wouldn't be as now and here, you know. It wouldn't be, this one could be, I mean, both simultaneous and consecutive. So consecutive, you can look at it and then you interpret, as I did. But simultaneous, you know, you must have watched Al Jazeera when they are interpreting somebody talking from America or from Bangkok or wherever in the world. You know, they interpret simultaneously. The person on the other part of the world is speaking, and the interpreter on Al Jazeera is trying to interpret into Arabic. Now his interpretation, we don't know how good it is or how bad it is. Why? Because we don't hear the English. We hear only the Arabic. Do you understand? But in general, we can get the message well. I mean, the interpreter on Al Jazeera is good, no doubt about that. You know, he does his job properly, and he manages to convey the message to the audience nicely and in good Arabic. Why? Because he has been there for a long time. He is very experienced interpreter, and there are certain what we say tools, environment, and this is I mean, it needs a lot of explanation about how interpreting takes place. But we'll come to this when we will be talking about the technology or the technologization and interpreting. So technology helps the interpreter a lot in achieving his job, in performing his job properly. So this is just a little example how you can really carry out interpreting at, let's say, a sentence level or a couple of sentence level, you know. So now this is example A from English into Arabic. We come back to the definition of interpreting. Somebody called, what we say, AutoCAD said, you know, his name, he's an interpreter, and he defines interpreting as a form of translation in which the source language text is presented only once and thus cannot be reviewed or replayed. So he defines interpreting as follows. It's a form of translation. But what form? It is where you see the source text, when you see the source text only once. Only once. You don't go back to it. You cannot say, oh, repeat what you have said. Well, I mean, it depends on the setting. We'll talk about it later, inshallah, in other lectures, whether you can say repeat or not. But formally, or in principle, when you have a source text, you cannot replay it, or you cannot review it. It is once presented, you translate it, and that's it, as I did in the English translation in example A. The second one, the target language text is produced under time pressure. Now, when you are trying to interpret or to produce the English version or the Arabic version, now you are under a lot of pressure. Time. You cannot, for instance, say, oh, I need 15 minutes to translate this sentence. Let me check it in the dictionary. No, you cannot do that. So you don't have time to really correct or revise and so on. So this is what makes really interpreting different. So, but after all, it is, it's an oral translation. It's an oral rendering of spoken message, but it should have, it has its own constraints. Its own constraints. You see the text once, or you hear the utterance once, and then you are under a lot of pressure to produce the equivalent of this text or this utterance into another language. Okay? Okay, now, I would like you to try, before you listen to my translation or interpreting to this sentence, you read this sentence and try it yourself. Can you interpret into English? If you can't, then you say, okay, let me listen to Dr. Halima. I haven't tried it. I did not translate it, by the way. I'm just probably seeing it for the second or third time, but I'm looking at it now to translate it. دخلت فتاة إلى قاعة الامتحان وهي في حالة إعياء وإجهاد واضح على محياها. A student entered the exam hall with a face, with a tiring face and exhausted. وجلس في مكانها المخصص في القاعة, and sat in her designated seat in the hall. وتسلمت أوراق الامتحان. She got the exam papers, or she received the exam papers. Some of you might say, well, this is literal translation, doctor, or this is not as good as translation, written translation. Fair enough, I agree with you. But did you understand what I was trying to say? If I passed you the message, then that's it. It's fine. I could do it again. A girl or a student entered the exam hall. She was very tired, and this appeared on her face. She sat in her designated seat in the exam hall, and then she received the exam papers. If I do it for the third time, it would be much better. Why? Because now so the more you translate it, the better your translation would be. But in interpreting, you don't have this luxury of repeating the translation or doing it twice or 3 times. No, once only. You hear it once, you produce it once. This is interpreting. Are you good at it? Can you do it? Then you decide. You answer this question. وفي غضون ذلك لاحظت المعلمة تلك الفتاة أنها لم تكتب أي حرف على ورقة إجابتها. During then, the invigilator noticed that the girl did not write anything on the answer sheet. حتى بعد أن مضى نصف ساعة من الزمن. Even after half of the time passed. فأثار ذلك انتباه تلك المعلمة. This made the invigilator anxious to know. فركزت اهتمامها ونظراتها على تلك الفتاة. Then she started to really watch this girl. Now, I don't want to go into detail. I don't want to go. فركزت اهتمامها ونظراتها على تلك الفتاة. You know, فركزت. Then she focused her. She focused her attention and looks on the girl. You don't have to go really in such detail. But you can say, well, the invigilator means the person who is watching in the exam paper, in the exam during the examination. You said, well, she started to watch her constantly. The English people will understand what you mean. She started to focus her invigilation on her. She started to give her special attention. I mean, all these equivalents are possible in interpreting. You know? But you can't say فركزت اهتمامها ونظراتها على تلك الفتاة as she looked at the girls, or she looked at the window, or she looked at her. She looked at the girls. No, it doesn't mean she really pay. It doesn't mean as if you said she focused. She concentrated on that girl. She gave her special attention. She started to look at her really constantly and with interest. You know. So you need to strike a balance between the idea and the meaning and the message. It needs a lot of practice. Don't worry. I mean, you can see I am a professional interpreter. You know. Nevertheless, you can see that when I interpret, it's not an easy job. It's not an easy task at all. It needs a lot of practice. But if you practice, you get there. You get there, inshallah. Okay. So now if I want to define it, based on the above, interpreting could be characterized. Look, these are the main characteristics of interpreting. Characterized as an immediate type of translational activity performed in real time for immediate use. You need to learn it. It means interpreting is different from translation, but it is like translation, but it has its own characteristics. It is immediate. It has a certain time you need to achieve under time pressure, and you use it immediately. You don't ask interpreting. You say to me, please interpret what he is saying and come and bring it to me in my office. No, you cannot say that. You can't say, okay, I'm going to interpret this to the other person. He is in the second room. Okay, tomorrow I'll give you what. No. Interpreting is here and now. It's immediate, and I want to know the interpretation now, the translation now. So this is what we mean by immediate type of translation activity performed in real time for immediate use. So it could be used, it could be defined. Interpreting is a form of translation in which a first and final rendition in another language is produced on the basis of one-time presentation of an utterance in a source language. Really, this is the definition of interpreting. Okay. Now here I have given you some examples. You practice. The exam questions might be based on the practical here, so I expect of you to be able to translate them. I might bring translation from this, from here, so please translate them, and then practice them with a friend, with a colleague, and he would read out and you translate. Don't worry, first time, second time. First, I advise you to check the difficult words, to get the meaning of the difficult words, put it next to it, and then you say, okay, I'm going to practice interpreting now. Okay, Ali, could you please read it out, or read sentence by sentence, and then you interpret, So these are exercises for you to, this is, few exercises for you, and then this is a practical B, exercises from Arabic into English. I would like, I hope that you have enjoyed this lecture, and I hope that you have understood what we mean by the concept of interpreting, and I hope that you have learned the definition of interpreting, and now you can define interpreting, and I hope that you have now had some idea about how interpreting is performed, and I hope that you will be able to do the exercises I have given to you. Thank you very much indeed, and I'll see you next lecture, inshallah. Thank you. Goodbye.